"Pull over!" Officer Rick barked into his cruiser's loudspeaker. The car in front of him slowed and pulled over, its engine purring to a stop. Officer Rick stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. "License and registration," Officer Rick snapped, his tone sharp. The black man he pulled over nodded, reaching into the glove compartment. "Of course, officer. May I ask what this is about?" Officer Rick didn't answer right away. His eyes roamed over the luxurious interior, the leather seats, the advanced dashboard. A smirk played on his lips. "What's a car like this doing out here? Are you a rapper or something?" The black man paused for a moment before responding, his tone measured. "No, officer. I have a 9 to 5. Officer Rick chuckled, low and mocking, flipping through the documents. 9 to 5, huh? 9 to 5 doing what? Flashing cash in the wrong part of town? Is there an actual issue, officer? Why did you pull me over?" The black man asked, his voice calm but firm. Officer Rick ignored him, holding up the ID. "Mr. Daniel, is this even real? Guys like you fake these things all the time." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "Guys like me? What exactly do you mean? That's a government-issued ID, officer." Officer Rick let out a derisive laugh. "Not anymore." He pulled a lighter from his pocket, flicked it open, and set the corner of the ID alight. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What do you think you're doing?" Officer Rick let the burning ID drop to the ground, grinding it into the gravel with his boot. "Making sure you know your place. As we begin this story, where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments, and if you believe that all people deserve to be treated with respect and regard, no matter the color of their skin, subscribe to this channel to show your support and spread awareness. Now, let's get into it. As the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the quiet Texas highway, Daniel Carter's sleek black car hummed smoothly along the road, its polished exterior reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun. Inside, Daniel, a sharp-dressed man in his mid-40s, drove with quiet focus, his hands resting confidently on the steering wheel. The calm voice of a leadership podcast played through the car's premium speakers, offering insights on decision-making under pressure. As the highway curved gently, Daniel noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. His jaw tightened slightly. He turned off the podcast, letting silence fill the cabin as the police cruiser closed in behind him. Daniel sighed, a mix of irritation and resignation crossing his face, before signaling and pulling over. The car came to a smooth stop, the tires kicking up a faint cloud of dust. Daniel adjusted his tie, glancing briefly into the rearview mirror to get a look at the approaching officer. He reached over to the glove compartment, pulling out his registration and insurance papers with calm precision. His wallet lay ready on the passenger seat, the driver's license peeking slightly out. As the police cruiser idled behind him, the officer stepped out, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. Daniel exhaled slowly, his expression neutral, waiting for what was to come. The sun dipped lower, casting long, tense shadows over the scene. Officer Rick Callahan stood beside the car, the papers in his hand as he eyed Daniel Carter with barely concealed disdain. He flipped through the registration and ID as if searching for a flaw, his lip curling slightly. The faint sound of cars passing in the distance did little to cut through the mounting tension. Officer Rick squinted at the ID, holding it up against the sunlight, as if inspecting it for hidden tampering. "This is fake, isn't it?" he asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. He lowered the card and leaned closer to the window, his eyes narrowing. "Guys like you fake these things all the time." Daniel's calm demeanor cracked slightly, his brows furrowing. He kept his tone steady, but firm. "Excuse me? That's a government-issued ID, officer. There's nothing fake about it." Officer Rick snorted, shaking his head with mock disbelief. "Sure," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Daniel to hear. Without warning, he flicked the papers carelessly onto the ground beside the car, the ID landing face up in the dirt. Daniel's eyes followed the papers, his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel before releasing. He turned his gaze back to Officer Rick, his expression a mix of irritation and restraint. "Was that necessary?" Daniel asked, his voice clipped but controlled. Officer Rick straightened, his smirk widening. "Pick it up if you want it so bad," he said, stepping back with deliberate slowness. The air between them grew heavy, the silence charged with unspoken tension. Daniel pushed open the car door and stepped out, his movements deliberate and composed. The afternoon heat hit him immediately, but his focus remained on the scattered papers lying in the dirt. He adjusted his tie and bent down to retrieve his ID and registration, brushing off the dust with quiet precision. Officer Rick's boots crunched on the gravel as he took a quick step forward, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. His voice was sharp, almost barking. "Get back in the car, you ghetto urchin!" Daniel paused mid-motion, his eyes slowly rising to meet Officer Rick's. He straightened up, his full height coming into view, his calm demeanor now edged with steel. His gaze didn't waver, locking onto Officer Rick with an intensity that made the officer hesitate for a fraction of a second. "What exactly is your problem, officer?" Daniel asked, his voice sharp and measured, cutting through the tension like a knife. Officer Rick leaned closer, his smirk twisting into something more aggressive. My problem is you. The sight of you makes my skin crawl. You irritate me. Do us all some good and go back to Africa." Daniel didn't flinch. His tone stayed even, but his eyes burned with restrained anger. "I haven't done anything wrong. You, on the other hand, seem to be stepping way out of line." Officer Rick's hand hovered near his baton, his posture stiffening as the situation teetered on the edge of escalation. The standoff was silent, but the tension felt loud enough to drown out the hum of passing cars. Officer Rick reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver lighter, flipping it open with a metallic click. His eyes gleamed with twisted amusement as he held Daniel's ID between his fingers, the flame dancing dangerously close. Without hesitation, he set the edge of the card alight, the plastic curling and blackening as it burned. Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief, his calm demeanor finally cracking. He watched as the smoldering ID was dropped onto the gravel, the faint smell of burnt plastic rising in the hot afternoon air. Officer Rick's smirk grew wider as he stepped back, arms crossed. "Now you're nobody," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Daniel's fury ignited. His fists clenched at his sides as he took a step forward, his tone low and threatening. "You just crossed the line." Officer Rick's smirk faltered for a second before he puffed out his chest, taking a step closer. "What are you going to do about it?" he taunted, his hand now resting on the baton at his belt. The tension exploded. Rick lunged forward, his composure shattered. Daniel barely had time to react before Officer Rick's shoulder slammed into him, forcing him backward. Then Officer Rick threw the first punch. The two men grappled, the scuffle kicking up dust as they traded blows. Officer Rick swung wildly, his baton clattering to the ground, while Daniel's strikes were calculated and powerful. Each man's pride and anger fueled the fight, the scene turning chaotic as the quiet highway bore witness to the clash. Officer Rick's hand shot forward, his fist aiming for Daniel's face. The punch connected but barely grazed Daniel's cheek, leaving a sting rather than real damage. The force caused Daniel to take a half step back, but his composure returned instantly, his eyes narrowing with steely determination. Without hesitation, Daniel countered. His fist moved with precision, landing a solid punch to Officer Rick's jaw. The impact sent Officer Rick stumbling back, his smirk replaced with a grimace of pain and anger. He spat to the side, glaring at Daniel with wild eyes. "You're gonna regret that," Officer Rick growled, lunging forward. The fight escalated quickly. They brawled beside Daniel's car, their movements chaotic, yet driven by sheer adrenaline. Officer Rick grabbed Daniel's arm and twisted it sharply, dislocating his shoulder with a sickening pop. Daniel let out a grunt of pain, but didn't falter. Instead, he retaliated with his good arm, delivering a crushing blow to Officer Rick's ribs. Officer Rick stumbled over, gasping for air, but he wasn't done. He reached for his baton, which lay on the ground nearby. Before he could grab it, Daniel kicked it away, his eyes blazing with fury. Daniel's strikes grew more relentless, each punch calculated and precise, his frustration fueling his strength. Officer Rick stumbled under the onslaught, blood trickling from his nose and mouth. The fight left both men bruised and battered, but Daniel stood tall, his breath heavy, as Officer Rick collapsed to the ground, groaning in pain. Officer Rick staggered backward, wiping blood from his nose with the back of his hand. His eyes burned with rage as he reached down and grabbed his baton. He straightened, gripping it tightly, and advanced toward Daniel with wild determination. "You should have stayed in the car," Officer Rick snarled, raising the baton high above his head. Daniel's eyes locked onto the weapon, his body tense. As Officer Rick swung down, Daniel reacted with precision and speed. His hand shot out, grabbing the baton mid-swing. The impact jarred his already injured shoulder, sending a wave of pain through him, but he didn't let go. For a brief moment, the two men wrestled for control of the baton, their faces inches apart, muscles straining. Then, with a sharp twist, Daniel wrenched it free from Officer Rick's grasp. The sudden shift in power froze Officer Rick, his eyes widening in shock. Daniel didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he swung the baton, striking Officer Rick's legs and knocking him to the ground. Officer Rick landed hard, the gravel scraping against his arms as he tried to scramble away. Daniel stepped forward, looming over him. His breath came in short, furious bursts. Daniel dropped the baton and unleashed a flurry of punches, each one fueled by the humiliation, pain, and injustice of the encounter. When Daniel finally stopped, Officer Rick lay bloodied and unconscious on the ground, his uniform stained with dirt and blood. Before we continue this heartwarming story, I'd like to give a shout out to this subscriber from Barbados, Velda Clark. If you would like a shout out in my next story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments and make sure you are subscribed to my channel. As Officer Rick Callahan woke up in a hospital bed, his head pounding and his body aching from the fight, his face was swollen, his nose bandaged, and bruises covered his arms and chest. As the events of the fight came back to him, anger bubbled beneath his pain. He wasn't going to let this slide. The door to his room opened, and a nurse stepped in to check his vitals. Behind her, another figure entered, a fellow officer with a notepad and a serious expression. Officer Rick sat up straighter, wincing as pain shot through his ribs. "What happened out there, Officer Rick?" the officer asked, pulling up a chair beside the bed. Officer Rick's lips curled into a sneer. "That driver, that black ugly monkey," he said, his voice raspy but dripping with venom. "He attacked me out of nowhere. I pulled him over for a routine stop, just our regular routine stops. I did nothing to him at all, and he went crazy." The officer scribbled in the notebook, nodding as Officer Rick continued. "He didn't just hit me," Officer Rick added, leaning forward as if to emphasize his point. "He beat me senseless, kept coming at me like a madman. I barely got out alive." Officer Rick's exaggerated testimony painted Daniel as an unprovoked aggressor, a violent man with no regard for authority. The officer jotted down every word, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that Officer Rick was leaving out the part about the burned ID and the first punch he had thrown. For Officer Rick, this was about reclaiming control. The next morning, 2 patrol cars pulled up to the driveway of a stately suburban home. 4 officers stepped out, their expressions grim as they prepared to make the arrest. Officer Rick Callahan's report had been filed, and they were here to bring in the alleged violent driver. Their radios crackled as they coordinated their approach, one officer knocking firmly on the front door. After a few moments of silence, an older woman opened the door. She smiled politely but shook her head. "Mr. Carter isn't here," she said. "You'll find him at his office in town." The officers exchanged glances, confused but undeterred. Minutes later, they arrived at the mayor's office, a prominent building in the center of town. Inside, the air was calm but tense. Daniel Carter sat behind a large oak desk, flanked by 2 sharply dressed attorneys. His tailored suit and composed demeanor gave him an air of quiet authority. The chief of police, who had accompanied the officers, stepped forward, his face stiff with confusion. "Mayor Carter?" he said, his voice laced with disbelief. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze icy and unyielding. "Good morning," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut. "I see Officer Callahan failed to mention who he picked a fight with yesterday. He can argue that he did not know, but it really makes no difference." The chief hesitated, realizing the situation had taken a dramatic turn. The officers behind him stood frozen, unsure how to proceed. The power dynamic had shifted, and it was getting very messy. In a crowded conference room, reporters jostled for space as cameras clicked and microphones buzzed. At the front of the room, Daniel Carter sat beside his legal team, his expression calm but resolute. His lead attorney, a sharp woman named Karen Hayes, adjusted her glasses as she addressed the press. "We're here to set the record straight," Karen began, her voice firm. "The events described in Officer Callahan's report are not only misleading, but a deliberate attempt to smear the mayor's character." Karen pressed a button on the remote in her hand, and a large screen behind them flickered to life. The room fell silent as dash cam footage from Daniel's car played. It showed the entirety of the incident. Officer Rick burning Daniel's ID, taunting him, and throwing the first punch. The escalation was clear and undeniable. Gasps rippled through the room as the footage ended. The images of Officer Rick's actions, burning the ID and initiating violence, painted a starkly different story than his report. Karen turned back to the reporters. This was a clear case of self-defense against a corrupt officer. Mr. Carter acted to protect himself after being physically attacked and provoked. Within hours, the footage went viral, sparking outrage across social media and news outlets. Headlines called out Officer Rick's blatant abuse of power and racial profiling. Protests began forming in the town, demanding justice and accountability. The narrative shifted completely, placing Officer Rick under intense scrutiny as Daniel emerged as a symbol of standing against injustice. If you are enjoying this story so far and learning valuable life lessons, hit the subscribe button right away. As the dashcam footage spread like wildfire, pressure mounted on the police department to investigate Officer Rick Callahan's actions. Public outcry grew louder, with protests outside the stations demanding accountability. Under scrutiny from both the media and local government, the department opened an internal investigation. A team of independent investigators combed through Officer Rick's history. What they found was disturbing. Records revealed multiple complaints of excessive force and racially motivated stops. Several cases had been quietly dismissed without proper review. Witness testimonies from past incidents painted a picture of a cop who routinely abused his authority, targeting minority drivers with unwarranted aggression. The investigators dug deeper and uncovered emails between Officer Rick and a few higher-ranking officers, hinting at a coordinated effort to cover up his misconduct. This revelation placed the department itself under a cloud of suspicion. The chief of police, already grappling with the fallout from Daniel Carter's case, now faced immense public and political pressure. Reluctantly, he called a press conference. Standing at the podium, his shoulders slumped, he made the announcement. Effective immediately, Officer Rick Callahan is suspended pending the outcome of the investigation, he said, his voice tense. We are committed to transparency and ensuring justice is served. The decision, though necessary, did little to quell the public's anger. Calls for the chief's resignation began to grow. Officer Rick's suspension marked the beginning of what would become a full-scale reckoning for the department, exposing a culture of corruption that had thrived for far too long. Officer Rick Callahan, now suspended and facing public disgrace, refused to go down quietly. From his hospital bed, he began reaching out to sympathetic figures in the community, friends, local business owners, and even a few officers still loyal to him. He spun a narrative of himself as the victim of a politically motivated attack. He's not a hero, Officer Rick said in an interview with a small local news station. Carter is a violent, power-hungry politician using this to push his agenda. He's trying to make me the scapegoat for doing my job. Officer Rick's words began circulating among certain circles in town, gaining traction among those who already distrusted Daniel Carter as mayor. Social media posts and flyers popped up, portraying Daniel as an unhinged leader, fabricating the incident for personal gain. A small but vocal group began rallying behind Officer Rick, demanding his reinstatement. But just as Officer Rick's efforts began to gain momentum, investigative journalists uncovered a bombshell. Digging into Officer Rick's past, they found evidence linking him to a secretive group of officers with ties to local white supremacist organizations. Old photos surfaced of Officer Rick attending meetings and social events with known extremists. Private messages revealed discussions about targeting minority drivers and protecting their own within the department. The revelations were damning. Public opinion swiftly turned against Officer Rick, his remaining supporters silenced by the overwhelming evidence. The story exposed a deeper layer of corruption in the department, and Officer Rick's campaign to salvage his reputation crumbled under the weight of his own misdeeds. Daniel Carter stood at the podium, the room packed with reporters and community members. The air was electric with anticipation. Dressed sharply in a dark suit, he exuded authority and determination. Cameras flashed as he began to speak, his voice firm but steady. "This town has seen enough," Daniel said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "The recent events involving Officer Rick Callahan are not isolated. They are part of a larger pattern of racial bias and misconduct within our police force. It's time for change. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Daniel outlined his plan for a major overhaul of the department. He announced the formation of a civilian oversight committee, mandatory anti-bias training, and the review of past misconduct cases. This is about accountability and ensuring that every resident of this town is treated with respect and fairness, he concluded to a round of applause. Later that evening, Daniel sat across from the chief of police in a private meeting. The chief, visibly uneasy, tried to deflect. "We're handling it, Mr. Mayor. These things take time." Daniel leaned forward, his voice icy and precise. "Time is up. Officer Rick Callahan needs to be terminated, effective immediately. This town deserves better." The chief hesitated, his face pale. "If we do that now, it'll look like—" Daniel cut him off, his tone unwavering. "Fire him, or I'll fire you." The chief's shoulders sagged in defeat. He knew he had no choice. The power now firmly rested in Daniel's hands. Officer Rick Callahan's career officially ended with a signed termination letter, handed down by a reluctant chief of police. The public outrage, fueled by the dash cam footage and revelations of Officer Rick's ties to white supremacist groups, made his dismissal inevitable. The final blow came when investigators uncovered Officer Rick's attempts to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses, leading to his arrest for obstruction of justice and multiple counts of misconduct. Handcuffed and escorted from his home by officers, Officer Rick kept his head down, avoiding the cameras that captured his downfall. His once loyal supporters had disappeared, silenced by the overwhelming proof of his corruption. Officer Rick's name became synonymous with disgrace, a symbol of everything wrong with the department. The pressure didn't stop with Officer Rick. Calls for accountability grew louder, and the chief of police, already under fire for enabling misconduct, announced his resignation. He stepped down amid public criticism, his legacy tarnished. With the department in disarray, Daniel Carter took charge. As mayor, he prioritized rebuilding the force from the ground up. He worked closely with community leaders and independent advisors to recruit new officers, emphasizing diversity, accountability, and fairness. Do you think Daniel did the right thing firing Officer Rick? Did Officer Rick get what he deserved, or was this punishment a little too much? Did he learn his lessons? Let us know your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Months later, a ceremony was held at City Hall to swear in the new recruits. Daniel stood at the podium, addressing the crowd. "This is a new chapter for our town, a chance to build a police force we can all trust." The applause was thunderous. For the first time in years, the community felt hope for a better, more just future. Daniel Carter stood on the steps of City Hall, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the crowd gathered before him. Hundreds of townspeople filled the square, their faces a mix of hope and determination. Banners with messages of unity and change waved in the breeze. The atmosphere was electric. Dressed in a sharp suit, Daniel looked out over the crowd, his expression calm yet resolute. He raised a hand and the murmurs quieted. A microphone stood before him, but it was his presence that commanded attention. "This has been a difficult journey for our town," Daniel began, his voice steady and clear. "What happened wasn't just about one bad cop or one act of injustice. It's about addressing a system that allowed this behavior to thrive. It's about building a community where everyone feels safe, no matter who they are or where they come from." His words echoed across the square, and a ripple of applause began to build. Daniel continued, his tone filled with resolve. "We've taken the first steps toward change, but this is only the beginning. Together, we can create a town that values fairness, accountability, and respect for every single person." Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss the next story when it drops. Justice isn't a moment, it's a movement. The end.